Hi there, thank you for being here. My name is Anastasia Mann. I am the director of SPIA in New Jersey, which is the Jersey program at the School of Public and International Affairs here at Princeton. Delighted to see you all for the third installment of three, the final installment in what has been a spectacular series on the New Jersey economy and how developments in this state and in the works in the state can be a part of a larger movement nationally. At SPIA in New Jersey, we do programming sometimes as good as this, and also there are some courses. We do outreach and programming. Right now we have an initiative happening on clemency in collaboration with partners at the ACLU and in the Public Defender's Office. If you're a Princeton University affiliated person and interested in getting involved in that, there are several of us here you could talk to. We'd love to have you engaged. So the organizer of this panel is Brandon McKoy, who is, I would say, the most knowledgeable public policy expert in the state of New Jersey, but he also knows what's going on nationwide, which is why he was the perfect person, which is why he had the vision, which is why this has been such a spectacular series. So, boy, are we lucky. Brandon is an alumnus of the College of New Jersey and Rutgers Blaustein School, and he's currently an affiliate of SPIA in New Jersey. He's a policy associate. Fellow. He's a policy fellow, which means that he might be available to you sometimes if you have an issue that you want to discuss, something you want to know more about, you could drop an email. He has a Princeton email. So Brandon is going to manage and moderate and just steer this conversation, and we couldn't be luckier to have him here. So thanks. Please join me in welcoming him.
Hi, good evening, all. Thank you for coming. Thank you for finding your way to the basement of this hall. My name is Brandon McKoy. I'm a SPIA fellow, and then I'm also the president of the Fund for New Jersey. I also was previously, I held positions at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in DC, and I was the president of New Jersey Policy Perspective for a little bit of time. And so, this is the part 3 of 3 in this series, and it really was developed with the idea that New Jersey, because we are between New York and Philly, we sort of get lost in the conversation sometimes. We don't really have a media market dedicated to our issues and our needs. If you see New Jersey on the 6 o'clock news, it's usually not for good reasons, usually like Bridgegate or something silly, right? But we need to talk more about what's going on in the state and how the state can lead the country, because we actually have accomplished a great deal in the state over the past 8 years, and we're going to need to continue to accomplish more as we move ahead. And so, our first conversation, which featured some tremendous folks, was about sort of the last 15 years of economic policy. Sort of the thinking on economic policy has shifted a great deal since the Great Recession, and sort of the things that were not on the table back then are really on the table now. The second conversation was about where we are in this current moment. It was a week after the election, so there was a lot of sort of, thinking about, okay, what does this mean for now? And for this conversation, I thought, it would be good to sort of stretch ourselves and think about what does the future look like. And I'm very thrilled to be joined by some tremendous folks who I think are really excellent about talking about how do we lead in a forward-facing fashion, in a bold fashion, in a way that's really thinking about how do we have an economics that meets people's needs in a real way. And so I'm thrilled to be joined by them. And so let me just introduce the folks that are here today with us, and then we can get started a little bit. And so furthest from me is Darrick Hamilton, who is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy, and he's also at the New School, and he's also the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy, also at the school, and just one of the forebears of baby bonds and guaranteed income, and is a massive advocate and leader on that front. So thank you, Darrick, for being here today. Next to him is Asha Banerjee. She is in the Population Studies and Social Policy program here at Princeton and used to work at Economic Policy Institute in DC and has a wealth of knowledge and experience on labor studies and economic policy, and an organization that I worked with a great deal at NJPP and CBPP. So thank you very much for being here, Asha. And then right here is Ryan Haygood, who is the president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, has been one of the most stalwart leaders on racial equity and social justice in the state of New Jersey for quite some time now, and somebody that I look to with regards to what should the sort of soul and morality of this state be. So thank you very much for being here, Ryan. So before we get started in earnest, I just really want to say thank you very much. There was a lot of folks that made this possible. This was just, Stacy was sort of like, what do you want to do? And I just said some random stuff, and then she's like, all right, let's do it. People made it real, though, so I really want to thank, Dean Jamal of the SPIA program, Labyrinth Books, the Princeton Library, the Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance, Department of African American Studies, the Program for Research on Inequality, the public lecture series, and then, of course, Stacy and your team with CC and Delma. Thank you for making this possible. And so I'm going to ask a question to all of you to start. We are going to sort of, talk for a little bit, but we'll do like 15, 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So definitely have that in mind as we're going along here. But just to each of you, anybody can take it to start. Just it feels impossible to start this conversation in earnest. Of course, without first recognizing how the election went, right, just in general. And so I think when you think about sort of those results and its impact on American economic policy and civil rights just over the next 4 years, what are you most concerned about? And also, by the same token, what do you think are now opportunities that might exist given the outcome? And whoever is brave enough to start can go with that.
All right. I'll take a stab at starting. So I think it's pretty clear that the next administration is not going to be pursuing rights, justice, or love. I don't want to speculate on whether campaign promises of explicit violations of civil rights or destructive economic policies are actually going to come to be, but the early signs are pretty bad. Today, we've already seen House Republicans target a trans representative, Sarah McBride, for no reason other than humiliation. So I think we are about to see sort of a politics and an economics of cruelty and punishment, whether this is in racist policies or anti-worker policies. Ultimately, this is all about disempowerment. And I just want to say clearly, to sort of foreground this conversation, just because of the results of the election does not mean that we give up on our values, our commitments to racial and economic justice. In fact, we as Princeton students, as New Jersey residents, we have to present and we have to live an alternative vision of that. So I'll start with the concerns. My biggest concern is that policymakers and Democratic policymakers are going to lose vision. I fear that we're going to only hear conversations about let's just run on inflation and forget talking about race or gender or anything. And while there are important lessons to be had, important conversations to be had, looking back, I do think the Biden administration should have done more policies around short-term inflation. Looking back, I do think, and looking forward, I do think economic policymakers need to rethink the way we think about economic prosperity. In the Department of Labor, we would look at things like the unemployment rate, we would look at poverty levels, but a job isn't the same thing as a good job or a well-paying job. And just because someone is over an arbitrary poverty line doesn't mean that they're not struggling to make ends meet. So I'm afraid that policymakers are just going to take the wrong lesson from this and not try again. But what I'm excited about is that, if anything, this election showed that people do want change. They don't want Biden 2.0, they don't want the economy of 2019, and they don't want the status quo. The economy of today is not good enough. So I think there is a steep climb ahead, but if anything, we now have the chance to think and to organize for how we are going to rebuild this economy. I actually had to teach the day after the election. It was an intro to public policy class for a bunch of college sophomores, and I was dreading it. But when I walked in the room, what I saw was students ready to discuss, ready to argue respectfully with each other and with me, and ready to think about what we do next. So I think that's a good sign.
Absolutely.
So this is the bipartisan economy that brought us Donald Trump. I think that's the lesson. If we frame it too much about Trump and not understand that he's a symptom, we will miss the mark and another Trump will come along at some point. So I like the phrasing, the framing of this. Ultimately, we need paradigm change. So this is, again, a paradigm that left people insecure, vulnerable, and fascism thrives on instability. So a strong man was able to exploit the base in us, relative status. So a question could be, what are the conditions that make for somebody to be able to essentially promote relative status as their platform? However bad your lot in life may be, you are not them. You are not these other individuals. And the reality is there's psychological solace in being better, having your group position over another group's position. There's also economic material benefits in a relative sense. And when you are absolutely vulnerable, there's a trade-off for your relative status. People will hone into their group and their group positioning. So I think that's a lesson for us to take away. That if we don't understand that economics, that politics, and then here's the other element that we often negate, identity group stratification, whether it's race, gender, the ways in which we divide people along tribal lines into deserving and undeserving, that is intertwined with our political economy. So that's a lesson for me. I'd say if we go to the second part of the question, what are some areas that we can be optimistic? I agree that there is, if we consider the long context, the trajectory of, at least since the mid-'70s, the oxymoronic growth without jobs or good jobs. If we consider the growing inequality, then there's demand for something different. We're at the cusp of a potential paradigm change. Of course, it can go a couple of ways, but there is some silver lining that we can do some big, bold things. I'll say one other quick point. Oh, sorry. I thought I was loud enough that... During the pandemic and the response, I think there's some silver linings in the ways in which we handled the last pandemic versus the Great Recession. And although inflation took the headlines, it is miraculous that we're not still in a deep recession or depression right now, considering what happened. And a vision, a big, bold vision that's articulated, I guess, in the framing of this whole thing, we kind of did it. We put moratoriums on evictions, moratoriums on foreclosures. If you had a job, although sloppily implemented, the PPP program offered you loans that were able to be canceled if you kept workers employed. If you were sick, although it was difficult to get to the hospital, you were not saddled with medical debt in that period. So we did the things. We put moratoriums on student loan debt. So I think there's some silver lining, but we have purpose and we have some stuff to build upon.
Love the question. Really appreciate Stacy and the SPIA team for hosting this along with our dear friend Brandon McKoy and the Fund for New Jersey, and great to be here with Asha and Darrick. You know, I love the question. I've thought a lot about the question. I love that we're having this conversation on the college campus with students and young people, because there's a thing that happens for the young people in the room, and it is that while in college and in graduate school, you tend to be most ambitious about what can be done, and particularly in difficult moments. And then as you get older and you do things like you buy a home and you have a family, this thing happens. You tend to become more concerned about the bills you have to pay and the job you have to keep to pay the bills. And the student that you were that thought you could change the world gives way to the reality of being an adult. I know that's a cynical view, but I'll explain more about what I'm saying. So I love the title of today's discussion, and I look forward to the discussion part. Where do we go from here? So a quick word about the here, and then back to the we. So on the here, so I have the really incredible privilege of leading the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. We're a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. That's my 501c3 disclaimer, Brandon McKoy.
Very good.
About 2 weeks before the election, I was in the kitchen with my wife. She and her girlfriends, black women, had really been activated around the election for all the obvious reasons. Folks know there were calls that black women led. The first call happened shortly after the vice president was officially the candidate. I think 44,000 black women joined that call, and they raised millions of dollars, and that gave way to like a real inspired movement of people to support this candidate. And my wife was asking me a question that had really kind of dominated the headlines and all the social media channels around black men in particular. And the question was, what, Darrick Hamilton, are black men going to do around this election? And it's a sophisticated question that's designed really to misdirect your attention from the thing I'll focus you on in a second. And I said to her and her girlfriends, some of them were looking at me skeptically, to be honest. I said, black men are gonna do what we always do. We'll follow black women. And I went on to say, Mary, that the vice president will probably get 80% of the black male vote. There have always been black men who've been influenced by an era of conservatism and who voted for another party. But for the most part, over time, if you look at it, black men typically have delivered about 80% of their votes to a particular party, and here they were not going to be any different. Election comes and goes, and as it turns out, black women, 92% of black women who voted for Vice President Harris, and about 78% of black men also voted for President Harris. Turns out they were the top, those two demographics, black women, black men, were the top two groups that threw their support behind the vice president. And after the election, I got a very good call. I got a call from a very good friend of mine, a white friend of mine, who was beside himself with grief. And he was already thinking about, what has to happen in the next election to respond to what happened in this one. And he already had a strategy, and it was something like this: Ryan, oh my gosh, one, I'm surprised it happened. Surprised it happened, I can't believe it happened, and here's what we need to do. We gotta figure out, how can we inspire more black men to vote in the next election? And I said, talk me through the focus on black people, right? Because I ran the numbers back. Why not focus on the majority of Americans who participated? The 71% who comprised white Americans. See, the truth is, as you all know, this is like not difficult math. White Americans were 71% of those who voted, and the majority of that 71% voted for Donald Trump. And so Donald Trump gets reelected on the strength of the majority of white America. And the reason why that clarity matters is because in the absence of it, my hero and some of your heroes, they'll call you with a strategy that's not really focusing on the here. That is the how, at least in part, we got here. And it wasn't on the strength of the black vote, either from black women or black men. And the reason that matters is because I've been a civil rights lawyer for my whole career, now 20 years, and I've seen this play out time and time again. And it's a situation like this, where a particular group, a demographic, here black voters, do their level best to protect democracy. And when democracy is imperiled, it's not hyperbole, as now, we return to the group that did its level best to protect democracy to ask them, how can we extract more from them? As opposed to focusing on the group that occasioned the result. And the reason I lift this up is because this, I think, on the here point, is a moment to really reassess what allyship looks like, particularly white allyship. For a very long time, we've used that concept, that idea very loosely, but we haven't talked about what it means for well-meaning white allies to have those conversations with their peers who helped to occasion the kind of result we saw in the last presidential election. I think if we're thinking about where do we go from this particular point, it is a call to white Americans on I'm gonna call it the right side of history, to turn the page. And the reason that matters is because that has been an element that has been lacking in our conversations when we talk about things like rights and justice, even as we think about centering love and the pursuit of those two things. The last thing I'll say is every year, New Jersey hosts this thing called the League of Municipalities. The League of Municipalities is, Brandon, I guess it's a meeting ground for New Jersey's elected officials.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
And Brandon called it Sodom and Gomorrah. And it turns out it happens in Atlantic City. No shade to anyone here from Atlantic City. And politicians at all levels, local level, state level, some federal elected officials, they go to Atlantic City to talk about, among other things, policy. And what was fascinating to me was even the most progressive Brandon McKoy elected officials that came to the League of Municipalities. I was just there for 12 hours. Let's keep it real. I was there for a short while. I came here. Even they were speaking in very hushed tones about how they would respond. Many of them are up for re-election next year, and there's also a governor's race. And I think, as it turns out, sort of to the top of the conversation, elected officials in particular are especially timid when they're worried about their re-election chances. I just turned 50 recently, and I'm a big fan of hip hop, and there's this famous group called Mobb Deep. If you don't know them, you should Google them. They have this famous song called Shook Ones, Shook Ones. And many of the elected officials I saw in Atlantic City are absolutely shook ones. And even the most progressive sounding among them will be keepers of the status quo, particularly when they're looking at the next election, which is why this conversation with you all, not shook ones, is so important as we think about pursuing rights, justice, and love.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all of it.
Brandon, if that's okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So one, I got to get cool like Ryan and be able to reference. But I loved everything you said. But I think a necessary condition for allyship is an economy that promotes inclusion. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we will always be vulnerable to the rational lure of a dominant political group towards their relative status. A couple of other points I'd say. More even with that black men vote, they were admonished, they were criticized, like it was more than just pointing out, but yet they are the most progressive voting male group consistently. What other group of men, about 80% will vote for the woman candidate, yet they get admonished? I think there's something to be analyzed around that. And there's a political project as to why they are the group that can be beat upon. A couple other things really quick. So what is the lure that Trump pursued beyond race? Well, he promoted nativism. So I guess I want to point out that it isn't just race. There are other attributes that one can exploit around difference, that broadly speaking, difference can get weaponized. So he did try to siphon off some black individuals with, turns out that narrative of black jobs probably worked on some people. So he created this lure that immigrants were coming in and threatening the relative position of black people. Obviously, we see it with gender. They leaned into a notion of a male superiority likened to a time that now is threatened by women in the workplace. Those were clear narratives. And then I'll also point out this: the definition of whiteness can change throughout history. And I'm not the first person to point this out. But that also is a tactic that is offered to non-dominant political groups or non-white groups in this context. The lure that you too can become part of the white establishment. So why is it that some immigrant populations will now adopt the nativist perspective? Well, identity itself is not so dichotomous. It has some fluidity. And there are attributes that people not in the dominant group can adopt that might get rewarded and with constraints.
That's a good time to probably queue up. So Darrick has a video that the Institute has put together. Do you want to just cue this video? Because we're going to start getting into sort of some big ideas for, okay, from a policy perspective, what do we do about this? Do you want to cue it up real quick and I can get it?
So the quick cue is, it's a shameless plug because we produced this video, so I'll use it as an opportunity to show it. But the big idea is we don't ask the question, what is the purpose of an economy? For many in this room that have had an economic class, I bet you're confronted with the first three questions when you start principles, which is what, how, and to whom. What gets produced, how it gets produced, and to whom distributed. But why is the question why not asked? So this starts with the point of we actually do get to choose the economy we want. And if we simply ask that question, we very well might have something different than we have right now.
I am doing my best to not become a museum of myself. I am doing my best to breathe in and out. I am begging. Let me be lonely, but not invisible.
Lord, please protect me today. Keep me safe, keep me away from evil and harm, keep me free. Guide me in the right direction, God. Watch over me, my brothers, my whole family. Amen.
You know, the current global economy, much of it I would describe as, characterized by the paradigm of market fundamentalism. It has worked for some people. It has unlocked, great wealth and great benefit, usually for people who are already in the upper echelons of, our socioeconomics.
The economy as it exists, and it works only for the few, is immoral by definition. Because the very source of that economy depends on that few being able to control the levers of power.
What is so pernicious about this is that the norms become almost naturalized. Poverty and inequality gets naturalized.
It doesn't allow us to engage the experiences the majority of our people have had. Instead, it tells you, you have been bad, you couldn't overcome these things, you weren't good enough, you weren't strong enough.
It's not reliable. Like from my experiences, at any given moment, it could just be over. And you just be right back to square one, don't got no job, trying to figure out how you're going, pay your bills and feed yourself. And, even if you got a family to take care of, you got to think about how you're going to, support them and take care of them.
The culmination of an economy that facilitates the hoarding of resources amongst a powerful elite has clear implications on our environment, on democracy itself, and our health.
We have to reckon with the fact that life expectancy is stagnating. This is the wealthiest country in the history of nations, and our life expectancy is stagnating.
You cannot have a thriving economy if the people are sick and dying, or wandering the streets suffering mental health issues.
It makes you feel like you're just trying to get by. You know, like you're not really doing what you're passionate about or what you really dream about doing. It's like just to survive. So it's no real joy in it, especially if you're on your feet all the time and wear and tear on your body.
So we have to begin to question what is our social contract. In other words, what are the things that we are obligated to do together as a civil society? By way of example, when you dial 911, the EMS comes.
When we have a problem, a good way to solve it is to begin with the solution to the problem. So if people lack jobs, then facilitate jobs, a federal job guarantee.
And guess what, corporations? If you have a contract with the federal government, you must pay your workers a living wage. It don't come by here. See, that's how to use the people's power on the people's behalf.
The economy should provide the conditions of home, which include safety and wellness and abundance.
And then income, guaranteed income, a base level of resource income that allows people to dedicate their time and effort in productive ways.
We should be talking about universal health care, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, when we saw just how important it was for each of us to be able to rely on a healthcare system.
You know, what we're talking about today is not so radical, nor is it so new. Coming out of World War II, we had the classic UN Declaration of Human Rights, and it promoted 5 rights: political rights, civil rights, social rights, cultural rights. Sadly, we have not given enough credence to economic rights.
I don't get no love.
Oh yeah, no doubt. How you been?
I was thinking about doing the hoodie orange.
Orange? Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
the hoodie orange, doing the logo white, right?
Uh-huh. It gives me more pride as a man that I'm generating this money myself. When you're working for yourself, it's like everything is you. You know, you generate your own clients. I go out here, I hit the pavement, man. I pass out my business cards, but it makes you feel good when you make money because it's like, that's all me.
One of the ways of thinking about economy etymologically is oikos, the house, the abode, the dwelling. That immediately is a place of comfort, of care, of teaching and learning.
Many of us are parents. I have 2 daughters myself. We need to figure out how to elongate that impulse to empathy so that we're not so concerned about how it's going to affect our station to lift someone else up.
People are sick and tired, to quote the great Fannie Lou Hamer, they sick and tired of being sick and tired.
You have this genre of individuals that are not satisfied with our system, and they're motivated to do something.
No one can sit this out because this is what it's going to take. To me, it flows from a respect and a humility in the face of how steep the challenge is.
If we want a moral economy, if we want an inclusive economy, we need a commitment to our values in an uncompromising way. And we need a whole movement of people from various walks of life, disciplines, and crafts committed to this vision to achieve justice.
It's really a win-win when you really think about it. It's maybe a little harder, but at the end of the day, you keep pushing and you're gonna make it, you know?
It'd be embarrassing if you didn't clap. No, I'm joking. No, should I say a little bit more about it, Brandon?
Yeah.
You know, we were intentional to bring together a poet, to bring together a commissioner of health, an economist, as well as a politician, because we think that the economics profession and society in general that presents our economy as something that's non-normative, that's scientific, is a big part of the problem. If we understand that all of this is grounded in norms, the current paradigm that we live in is grounded in norms, an emphasis on certain things that we value as opposed to other things that we could value. I guess if we begin with the question of what is the purpose of an economy, you might define it. I know ways in which we might define it. Our ideas of justice is to promote self-determination, authentic agency. The ability to vote when you're hungry, the ability to civilly protest when you're unhoused, that's not freedom. You don't have capabilities. In a transaction economy, if you enter it with no resource, no power, you're at the whim of somebody who has resources, exploitation, or charitable inkling. So regardless of whether you want to promote more transaction as your political economy base or more command, we're arguing that, one, we need to define what its purpose is, and we believe an economy that centers people and the environments in which they live, where we value things like tranquility. Why is tranquility not an economic goal, a political economic goal? And then Brandon has in the title of this, love. Right now, we conceive of the family as an input in promoting economic activity. Well, why don't we flip that equation? Why can't family, the ability to choose and define who you want to love and live with, why is that not a goal? Why is that not a societal goal to promote towards individuals? In which case, economic resource might be the critical element to promote that. So, again, I think the key things are, one, we get to choose, and it's going to take a political movement for us to be able to choose. Two, what we value in terms of self-interested accumulation is out of whack with what is righteous and consistent with a notion of justice. That could be an element, but to achieve self-determination in authentic ways, beyond political, economic, cultural, and social rights, one needs a base level of resource in certain domains. And without the economic rights aspect of it, not only is it inadequate, it's a co-opting notion of freedom. And the co-optation is the onus of inequality is put on individuals rather than structures. You have choice, you have freedom, so it naturalizes poverty and inequality.
And getting ready for this conversation and sort of promoting it, I talked about love as, an economic priority, and the person I was talking to, kind of politely scoffed a little bit. And I was like, okay, but, what is the goal of everything we do if it is not to make it easier for people to love themselves and their family and their communities? And that sort of brought them up short, and they said, okay, fair point, right? But why are we so afraid to talk about these things in those frameworks, in those contexts, and how can we lead with that as not an implicit or passive goal, but an explicit and proactive goal, And so I'm going to combine, because y'all have done a great job of talking, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. Ryan, you are currently engaged in a very interesting and important practice and effort to have New Jersey pursue reparations in an honest way. I wonder if you could speak to what that experience has been, how, you can give the short version of how that developed, and because there's a story as to how and why that developed, and then equally to you, Asha, just thinking through your career of exploring disparity and discrimination, there's such a resistance to tackling the status quo. As you think about some of these big ideas like reparations, like basic income, whatever it may be, what do you think about ways to sort of advance movements that are pushing for change? But Ryan, go first.
Yeah, I love the way that Darrick frames, I think I heard him talk about it elsewhere, as centering love as a policy priority. particularly in a country there's so much division and hatred. You know, I had to push back, as some of you may have had to do, from social media. I wrote this article recently, and just the vicious nature of the vitriol is just, you know, it's the opposite of love. And so to the question, you know, I think reparations really inspires a conversation that brings clarity about sort of where we are, how we got here, and how we pursue love through repair. So really, really quickly, this was kind of in the throes of the COVID-19 moment. You know, we were virtual, as you all remember, and I was on, it felt like my 100th Zoom call. This was we're in the throes of COVID. This was also following George Floyd's murder. And on this call, they all started in kind of the same way, which was, you know, in this profound moment of loss, you know, COVID, George Floyd, broader structural racism, harm. The question was, how can we, how can we reduce the harm, in this case, to Black people? And I began to think, it can't just be the case that the goal for Black folks, the strategy for Black folks is largely a harm reduction strategy, right? If we get honest, so much of, I love Darrick, you know, the video, so much of we think about Black people, it's often around racial disparities. How do you close disparities? There's a wealth gap, how do you close it? And we rarely get to the conversation around what might it look like for Black people, in my context, to win. And even when you ask, not you all, but far less thoughtful group of folks, what might winning look like, we go back, well, I want to tell you about the harm, right? We're so conditioned to both think about, center, and respond to the harm. And I said, yes, part of the strategy for Black people, people of color more broadly, is around harm reduction. But what might it look like if we were to imagine a world in which Black people win? Really quickly, Brandon, I even tell the story because it kind of crystallizes a lot of what we've talked about. I was speaking to an audience very recently about New Jersey's racial wealth gap. And I talked about how in New Jersey, the median net wealth for white families is $322,000. This is among the highest in the country. And I said, you know, by staggering and really shameful contrast, the median net wealth for Black families in New Jersey is $17,700. This is a $300,000 plus racial wealth gap. And there was a really earnest and courageous middle-aged white gentleman who was right here in the front. And I knew he would have questions because of his visceral reaction to the numbers. And so I was finished, I called on him, he stood up quickly and he said, you know, those numbers, like, those are incredible, where'd you get those numbers? And I pointed him to our recent report. That one showed the data came from like footnotes 26 and 27. And so he was satisfied with the credibility of the numbers. As we moved to the second point of his query, which was really more of a statement, when he said, you know, the reality is the reason that the wealth for Black people is so low is because Black people tend to be underemployed. And when they are employed, they tend to be prodigal with their resources. Essentially, the low net wealth for Black people is a function of their own personal failures. It's a true story, you all, and it happened in front of witnesses. There were lots, and I appreciated his own clarity, however misinformed, and that he was willing to articulate in front of a bunch of folks. And then he went on, I'm almost done, Brandon, to his third point, and he said, you know, and here's the thing, he said, I'm a white man, and it was clear. It was clear. And he said, I don't have $300,000 in wealth. And it was, you know, it was a pause, and folks are wondering what was I going to say, and I thought about it, and I just said back to him the truth. I said, well, you know, my man, you know, that is a personal failure. Take a minute. I said, folks, that's cold-blooded, right? Take a minute. And here's the reason, really, really quickly. When New Jersey was founded as a colony, right, we gave each English settling family 150 acres of land, New Jersey. And we gave those same English settling families, those white English settling families, an additional 150 acres of land for each enslaved Black person that worked on that land with them. That was the beginning of our racial wealth gap. It was conceived of, it was birthed in slavery during our formation as a colony. And we carried that inequality forward through a series of policies and practices. We had cottaging that followed slavery. In the South, they called it sharecropping. We had restrictive covenants that governed where Black people could buy and live if they could buy, up to predatory lending practices and redline communities. Our racial wealth gap of today, the $300,000 racial wealth gap, was created in slavery in New Jersey. And if you poll people, far less sophisticated people than you all, and ask them what that reflects, if you divorce the history, then the explanation follows from our hero that it's a function of personal failures. But if you actually go back a bit and understand the historical underpinnings of how we design land and how we design who got that land and how they derive value from the land, you'd understand there's actually a direct line from slavery in this state to today's racial wealth gap. And so part of what, I'm done here, Brandon, inspired the push for a conversation around reparations is that not only did I want to get away from this harm reduction strategy, but I also began to realize our own limitations in the work that we do around racial justice, around pursuing many of the things that Darrick talks about. Very important steps in the right direction, but to really close the racial wealth gap in New Jersey, we need much more substantial investments than the kind that we've been making. And that, for me, is really what inspired the conversation about reparations. Last thing I'll say is in the absence of having the conversation, right? In the absence of having the conversation around what reparations is, this idea that we confront our past and its enduring harm, and then together think about how we might respond to the harm through policies and practices and investments, that conversation is co-opted. And so it was amazing for me to see just last week President-elect Trump talk about reparations in the context of providing restitutions to white victims of reverse discrimination, right? And so what I find fascinating is the conversation is going to happen one way or the other. The question is, will we have the kind of reparations conversation that leads to the pursuit and attainment of the very collective love that we all hold dear?
Thank you.
So I'll try to build off of both of these as a researcher, a new researcher trying to think about all of these issues. And I do want to say I've just been so inspired by both of my co-panelists here and basically had to relearn and forget all of Econ 101 to try to think about how the economy is the way it is today. And you can't do that without going back to slavery and sort of how these gaps developed. And so what I think is really important for policymakers, for students, for researchers to really understand is that policy is not a vacuum. Like the world we see today, the poverty, the unemployment, it didn't just materialize or happen. It's all active. It's all the result of policy choices and that have been made and shaped by the institutions and policymakers around us. And you'll hear all these arguments about, oh, actually it was determined by the market, or they'll try to individualize the problem. Oh, they don't have the right skills for the modern globalized economy. They don't have the right financial literacy, or what was it, prodigal with resources. Like there's so many different ways of individualizing this. But actually, it's all just built in. And the institutions that were meant to protect workers, especially workers that had been shut out of the economy for so long, have failed. And so what you're left with is, in this country, you just have this architecture of low-wage, low-protection labor with at-will employment in right-to-work states where you can't unionize. Public services are shoddy. These programs are either impossible to apply for, or they're so meager they don't really do anything. And, policymakers made this happen. It didn't just happen. And sort of bringing it back to New Jersey and where we're having this conversation, some states are better than others. New Jersey has one of the higher minimum wages in the country. It has a more generous UI program. But I think if you sort of try to bank on being slightly better than the really worst ones, it just builds this air of complacency. And what is the point of a higher minimum wage if rent today is 20% higher than it was in 2020? What is the point of having generous unemployment insurance if you can't afford to live? And so these policies just counteract each other. And so when you hear politicians running on campaigns of the status quo or acting like they had nothing to do with the economic devastation around them, you get results like the election, I think. And I think to sort of turn it slightly more positive, policy change is popular. We also saw that with the election. You know, in states like Alaska and Missouri, voters voted to increase the minimum wage. We saw abortion get, constitutionally protected in other states. We saw paid leave. So we see that policy is popular. But unfortunately, you're also seeing conversations of, from Democrats and from this extended ecosystem of pollsters and pundits and donors and campaign financiers of, we should have just been more moderate. But I think that those groups have a vested interest to keep the status quo and to keep the system the way that it is. And so to sort of sum up, I think it's vital to see the world as sort of this active outcome of policymakers around us and the policies that we've seen from centuries built up. And, it was shaped. And so I think if it was shaped one way, it can also be shaped another way. As Professor Hamilton, you said in your video, we can choose the economy we want. And I think that's a pretty optimistic thing as well.
Absolutely. So as was said previously, next year is a gubernatorial election. Not just most, but every member of the legislature is up for re-election as well. And you've seen a couple of folks who ran for Congress who won, who then 3 days later were like, actually, I want to be governor. Right? Thank you for your vote and faith and trust in me to be your congressional rep. I'm going to run for governor now. And something else happened last week. I said that I used to run NJ Policy Perspective, so I'm a little biased, but they put out what I thought was a very thoughtful report on tax policy in the years ahead. And they said basically, hey, the state has a structural deficit of $5 billion, right? Our general budget overall is about $55 to $60 billion, so that's 10% of the budget almost. Unless there's going to be significant cuts to programs and investments, we need to raise revenue. And here's some ideas for how to raise that revenue equitably and thoughtfully and intelligently, yada, yada. And later that afternoon and the next day, several candidates for governor who I can only assume only read the headline of Progressive Group Wants to Raise Revenue, put out statements saying, I commit to not raising taxes, right? And so we are yet again stuck in this very uninformed loop of conversation where instead of being able to talk deeply and thoughtfully about the challenges that face us and what are we going to do about them, and rather than having a budget process that thinks about what we want and what is the tax policy that will deliver that, we have a budget process that says how much do we already have and how are we going to split it up, right? We will be left with nothing but the status quo if we continue to operate in that fashion. And so, that's a process question. Process is not sexy to a lot of folks, but process is policy, personnel is policy, who is in the seat matters a great deal. I guess one question I would have for the three of you is, a lot of the ideas that have been bandied about are big ideas that definitely do rely on significant championing by the federal government. But given the resources of a state, which is going to be lesser than the federal government, what are some things that you are hoping states, and maybe especially New Jersey, pushes forward in this moment or in these years ahead?
So states have the reality of having to balance their budgets in ways that the federal government does not, given the U.S.'s sovereign monetary power. So that is a reality. But from a power building apparatus, states are able to build power that often trickle up to the federal government. We've seen that happen as well. Strategically in this moment, obviously we should be doubling down on the state apparatus as well. But I'll say this, there is no silver bullet policy, and that's often a mistake that the progressive movement makes. We get transactional with particular policies and end up arguing as to why our particular policies so much better than others. And then here's the other thing that we lack, vision, North Star. There's a clear conception of freedom that exists right now, which is probably everybody in this room could articulate. free from tyranny of government. Everybody pulls themselves up. You're the captain of your fate. That's an appealing narrative. And I wouldn't want to abandon the self-determination aspect. We need the resources in order to fulfill it. So I would put forth approaches that frame industrial policy as investing in people and the environments in which we live, not simply as consumption agents or not simply as entities to be compensated after some market transaction to make them whole, but literally as productive agents, literally as contributors to a dynamic, innovative economy, but in righteous conditions. So that's the framework, and then the policies that can come around, all the ones that we mentioned. Use your tax code as a mechanism to distribute income. What's the difference between a tax deduction and a refundable tax credit on a state ledger? Nothing. Normative perspectives about who's deserving and undeserving. And we've seen cash is an efficient mechanism for distribution, and it also adds to productivity of individuals. I would promote, there's movements along with regards to baby bonds across various states. And it's not universal, it's targeted because states have constrained budgets, but we're investing in next generations. And we don't have to wait until the distribution of the resources, hopefully, to see some results. It fits in a framework of trust-based governance rather than punitive fines and fees, managing poor people the way Sosh, I'm forgetting the authors, Richard Schramm and forgot the other author, when they talk about disciplining the poor. Rather than that disciplining the poor framework, let's invest in something as dear to them as their children. So I suspect that changes the relationship between states and families over the life course. So I'm going to stop rambling because I know Brandon wants us to conclude, but I think we know the policies. These are domains in which, without them, people don't have agency in their lives. That would be access to be able to see a doctor when you're sick, public banking, what else? Being able to not be threatened with violence because of your identity when you traverse the streets and engage in the public. So we need to get rid of that. So one more I'll say is we can be proactive in detecting discrimination. So if you're going to get a contract with the state of New Jersey, then rather than being reactive to whether the firm is engaging in good hiring practice, let's send out testers. Let's test and see if they engage in fair hiring practices. And if they don't, then they're subject to losing that contract or prosecution. So absolutely. Whatever the domain is, let's be starting with the solution. Let's think of it as investments in people. I think that's a way, along with a nice vision around justice, I think that's a good way to govern at the state level.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would just say the policies that Darrick lifts up are made possible by people who advocate for them. So, I think I shared this earlier, but I think no matter how progressive sounding an elected official is, that progressive sounding elected official will be a keeper of the status quo and the absence of accountability to do the thing. So I was thinking about the minimum wage fight that Brandon led, and we worked with him on raising it to 15 some years ago, and ultimately it passed, and now people think of it as sort of normative, but it wasn't.
My students say, "Why'd you settle for 15?" And I'm like, "Damn."
Yeah, fair question. Right? As soon as it got to 15, it was outdated, right? But even the fight to get it to 15 was an absolute fight. There were politicians and businesses who resisted it mightily. They now claim it as something they supported all along, and that's kind of the nature of this work, right? There's this tension that exists, and it really is people who use their voices to advocate to realize those policies. Because very often politicians will lift them up in a speech, but they won't then work to make them real, and that's really where partnerships with nonprofits, broader community folks make those real. And then you start to see the very thing they resisted become incorporated into their campaign speeches. Next thing you know, they're asking for a living wage, right? No strategy to get there, but they lift it up in speech, and then it's on us to make that real too. And as soon as you get a living wage, you realize even that is insufficient to meet the moment.
Yeah, just on federal versus state, what I'll add is I think there does need to be a real conversation about the inability of the federal government to pass legislation quickly or in any sort of way that makes people feel like their lives have been improved. If you think of the most recent piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, tremendous investment in climate and, technology and industrial policy, but it's going to take years for people to feel the effects. It's going to take years for people to be implemented. It's going to take maybe a decade for the environmental or economic effects to truly be seen. And so in that sense, that's a good place for the states to come in. If the federal government is unwilling to or unable to raise the minimum wage above $7.25, states can come in and fight for better. So I do think there is hope to see action on the state front. But I also think it's important to be, especially after the election, honest and introspective about where states have failed as well. And I think blue states especially have been some of the worst on housing policy, which contributes so greatly to inflation and the cost of living crisis. And it's just so sad to see so many people, hundreds of thousands of people, move from places like California, New York, DC, even New Jersey, to places like Texas and North Carolina. And it's just because those governments and those cities make it easier to build. The other good policies we have don't really matter if young people, if families, if retirees can't afford to live there. So I hope in the future to see more state action on housing, zoning reform, permitting reform, multifamily housing reform, and sort of for states to uphold this commitment that we can all thrive in the state.
Thank you.
In terms of visioning, Inflation Reduction Act, that's a horrible name. And the act had very little to do with reduction in inflation, if any at all.
Yep.
Mansion.
Yes. So we're going to get to Q&A, so think about that, but I'm going to ask one more question before we get there. It just so happens that at the top of this hour, the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts, will be giving a speech or giving remarks somewhere on campus. And I was looking at the picture of the poster, and it says, "Should we burn it all? A blueprint for American institutions," and it sort of says, it talks about whether parts of America's heritage deserve to endure. And a year ago, I was actually at EconCon, which is a conference that is held by a bunch of progressive economic institutions. And it was right after the passing of William Spriggs. He was an economist at Howard who had a tremendous legacy, taught a lot of people that you see currently in the Biden administration pushing big ideas. And he was a black man who fought unequivocally for an economics that was expansive and that was productive and that was inclusive. And I think he did so in a lot of rooms and spaces where people laughed at that idea, but he never wavered, right? And so I think about him a lot in these conversations. And how do we conceive of these ideas? And so, just his career and what he put into the world has always left me with the idea that no matter what happens, there's more that we can do to deliver for people. And so I would ask, as you think about, Brian, you spoke about, hey, we're in this space with a lot of young, idealistic college folks who want to change the world. If there's one thing that you want folks to take away as we think about these next few years, what would that one thing be before we get to the Q&A?
Mm-hmm. Love that question. So back to the moment when I was on the Zoom, I pressed forward and I said, we've got this incredible racial wealth gap and this harm. What should we do? I threw it back to the virtual audience, and there was an earnest person who said, we need more mentoring programs. Every kid at Westside High School in Newark should have a mentor. And that resonated with me because as a kid, I had a big brother through the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. And it also hurt my heart because, not to diminish mentors, but the solution to the $300,000 racial wealth gap is not a mentor. right? The harm is so vast. $300,000, you can't throw enough mentors in there. And I lift that up as a serious point because I would encourage, as you all are passionate about various things, right? And in the big harm category, I would say that make sure that the remedy you're seeking is commensurate, is proportional to the harm. That the remedy you seek to the harm that breaks your heart can actually meet the harm. When we're talking big harm, it should be big remedy. And part of that requires big vision to meet the moment. And I don't say that to sound sort of Pollyanna-ish. I think what we lack in politics too often is a failure of imagination, a failure of ambition, and a failure of courage. So yes, mentoring programs in that example are meaningful, but that for me is why reparations is such an important conversation, because in order to understand the remedy, we have to understand how vast the harm is. In litigation, there's two pieces to it. The first one is around liability, and the second one is around what's the remedy for the harm that we've discovered. And I would encourage that the North Star be an ambitious vision for meeting the harm that grieves you, right?
Thank you.
So I was just thinking about when you were saying pitching this panel about love and why we do the work we want to do. And so I wanted to chime in with why I do this work. So I am a proud daughter of immigrants. My parents came with just a few suitcases to Reagan's America, made it their home, made it my home. And the Women, Infants, and Children's Program, WIC, it was juice, milk, eggs, cheese that my mom got when my older sister was born. And I grew up learning about it and thinking about it as an investment, not a handout. This was an investment and a contract from the government that this support now is going to build the potential and hope for this new little American. And if we think in terms of dollars and cents, like whatever WIC and the food cost has long been paid back in taxes and all of that. But if we think of economics as love, that childhood investment helped build a person full of love who works every day to give back. And, you know, in the aggregate, that is why I do what I do. And I also just wanted to point out that I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Bill Spriggs back in DC when he was the chief economist at AFL-CIO. And not only was he brilliant, but he was so kind and generous when I was brand new and a nobody in policy. And his economics had a real impact on me, thinking about how economics and social justice are inseparable. It's unacceptable to tolerate a black unemployment rate 2 times the white unemployment rate. We have to do better. And so what I wanted to say as my takeaway, inspired by my co-panelists, by Dr. Spriggs, my first one is exactly what Ryan said, is to think bigger. To all the students, the social scientists out here, think bigger beyond the models we learn in class, beyond the legislation we learn about in policy, and beyond the status quo that politicians tell us is as good as it's going to get. This is not the time to shut off and tune out. It's extremely tempting, but this is actually when we need good policy, because we are going to need good policy after this administration. But we don't need to rebuild to 2019 or 2024, right before the election. We don't need to rebuild to the New Deal or the Great Society, but to something that we haven't seen before. And there's a chance for creativity and for all of us to be a part of that. And my second point, just a point just to all the students here, is just to remember the people and love behind the data and the numbers that we look at every day.
Thank you.
So, our is a strong word. From no scholarship is strictly scientific, devoid of norms. So we get to choose. It's our economy, it's our government, it's our monetary system. So we do get to shape and define it. The question is power. How do we seize power to be able to enact those choices? The other thing I'll say, which might be a little more polemic, and I'm at Princeton, anybody pursuing inequality devoid of a stratification lens around identity is not only inadequate, but you're contributing to the problem. You're permissive of a political economy that allows us to, on one side of the aisle, not even use the word race, suffer in silence, where other sides of the power dimension, whether they're explicit or not, are certainly weaponizing race in order to fulfill their goals. So I guess I'm saying something stronger in light of, or somewhat analogous to King's statement about the moderate being the biggest obstacle to a scenario of justice. To my academic brethren that particularly are pursuing inequality devoid of an identity lens, you're not only inadequate, I think you're part of the problem. And then finally, Bill Spriggs. One of the big things that comes to mind with Bill Spriggs to me, two things. One is legacy, and that's important for a movement. So young people in the room, older people in the room, there's a problem we have with continuity across generations. So I would say to young people and older people, that word legacy can resonate. The capability for our work to live on, not everybody doesn't have to do the same things we do, but we hope that what we do can contribute to a next generation in a respectful way to help shape and form some of the stuff that you do as well. So I think that word can help facilitate some generational change. And the second thing is Bill Spriggs was a humanist. So I hope, I'm trained as an economist, but I hope my identity that's left is that of a humanist, someone who ultimately cares about humanity and their well-being and longevity.
Awesome. Well, my takeaway is thankfulness. I'm just a kid from South Orange, and I'm very fortunate to be able to be in this space. And so thank you all for dedicating your time and your expertise. And thank you for being with us today. And so we'll do Q&A. We have like 15 minutes, I think, and Cece has a microphone. So if anybody has a question, just raise your hand, and we can go.
Hi, thank you for being here. For context, I'm also from New Jersey, from East Rutherford, not too far from Newark. My question is about a point you brought up about framing industrial policy as a way to lift up people. So in New Jersey, as someone also from a very working class neighborhood and a working class background, we're in a very precarious position because we are a very high tax state, and yet we still have these budget gaps. And New Jersey is perceived as generally business unfriendly, and we've seen that in the last several decades. We've hemorrhaged a lot of working class blue-collar industrial jobs. And part of the repudiation to that response we saw during the election. New Jersey had a huge shift to the right, even in places, particularly in places that have a lot of working class communities. So could the argument be made that the state's relatively progressive economic policies are actually hurting both the state's industrial policy and the working class people it's supposed to protect, supposed to benefit? And if so, how do we balance a progressive economy with a progressive industrial policy that actually benefits working people?
So one, I'd say we need to rethink how we define industrial policy. Industrial policy, in my mind, is the strategic direction of public resource for industrial purpose. So that going towards people need not simply be thought about as charitable, but innovative. I think humans are our most treasured and productive resource. I don't think the vision is anti-firm or anti-capitalist per se. I'll say what it is, though. It is anti-exploitive firm endeavors because it rebalances power in a way that's less exploitive. So I'm not one of the progressives that will argue we all win, 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 win. There certainly will be a loss. But I also think that on the progressive side, we cede the economic space too much. That these things that we're talking about aren't simply charity, they are productive.
I'll just offer that I think, from my perspective, the challenge that we have in New Jersey is that our political rights do not match our economic rights. The political system we have here actually wastes a lot of our government resources. County government is a backwater. in New Jersey. You look at Maryland, county government is used to deliver a lot of benefits and resources. It's used to coordinate education. It's used to coordinate, a DPW and roads. In New Jersey, it's kind of used for, parks, and that's about it. And it is a political patronage system. And until we have our democratizing moment, which maybe we are on the cusp of now that we have gotten rid of the ballot line, knock on wood, we will continue to suffer, and we will not see the benefits of statewide economic policy get to the ground because the political structure we have sucks it up.
And by the way, I don't think that this is an untested idea. I think history shows that we pursued industrial policies that were directed towards investing in human capacities and the capacities for human to thrive, and it benefited our economy in general. The distribution of profits going to firms is different today than it was then, but in terms of economic activity, I think we have historical precedent.
I would also add that something that Professor Hamilton has emphasized is that we don't necessarily need to view economic policy as, in an austerity mindset. It's either one or the other, and I do think the industrial policy investments will have positive benefits in the long term. It's a tough process to shift from, old manufacturing jobs to like new green technology and semiconductors, and that takes a lot of time. And the Inflation Reduction Act does put a lot of money into that, but it's going to take a long time. I think the problem is not that they did that, but is that they didn't, on the other side, deal with the right now. The policies towards addressing the cost of living. And in New Jersey, you've seen transit prices go up for public transit without, increases in quality that you'd expect. You've seen housing, you've seen everything go up. So, the industrial policy was, I think, a great investment for the future, but it needed to be paired with, policies for right now that, could have been done. There's plenty of money in New Jersey and to make it happen.
Yeah. And even just, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act or other federal policies, we are unlikely, I'm 38, I'm unlikely to see that level of investment again in my lifetime, and states did not take advantage of it. A lot of them cut taxes saying, hey, we're flush with cash, so let's cut taxes now. Party's over, right? The money is not gonna keep on running, and instead of taking the opportunity to get their fiscal house in order to be able to take advantage of this opportunity, they just did, they leaned into stale, trickle-down 1980s tax policy ideas. And New Jersey didn't lean into it as forcefully as maybe other places did, but we did not take advantage of the federal support when we had the opportunity. So I worry now that, to your point, folks are not seeing the benefit on the ground because lawmakers did not think, okay, here's what we're getting from the feds. What do we do in the meantime with that window? They can't see past the next election. They can't see past 6 months. That's because we have to force them to. Any questions?
Hi, my name is Mary. Okay, so my question, towards like the beginning of like the discussion, I think it was Asha who like mentioned how like a lot of like roles or like business role job positions or like job positions that have those high wages are normally seen as like roles that are like unequipped or like where black people or uneducated people are seen as like unequipped for these roles. So like, do you have any of like thoughts on like how we can like, I don't know if debunk is the right word for it, but like kind of like denormalize these theories or like these norms of like having to have like certain skills or like having to have a certain amount of education that assumes you have these certain skills to be in these high paying like positions.
Trump's administration might debunk all of this. We wait.
Yeah, you're on a panel of experts definitely here, but I can start. I think when we think of American policy, and especially economic policy, I think two key things to think about are narratives and institutions. I think the narratives around Black people especially, and sort of individualizing this very systemic problem have been so pervasive, and they've been in play for decades. Like, my parents told me about, like, you know, the welfare queen narrative and all the commercials that would run in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And so this new generation of, you know, conservative policymakers, you know, grew up like with that language of, oh, you know, people want to be dependent on the government. Oh, they can't do these jobs because they don't have the right skills. You know, if they just got education or they just learned how to code, they do all of this. But like, none of that addresses the systemic nature of this. Like, the discrimination is like baked into the economy, and it started from, you know, generations ago. And, you know, you can't think about the black-white wage gap or income gap without thinking about how Black workers weren't even included in the federal minimum wage until the 1960s. And so I think countering these narratives is going to take time, but it's going to be it needs to be, you know, really prioritized by current policymakers. And with institutions, I think one thing people can do is really enforce anti-discrimination. And so, you know, these institutions that were built during the Civil Rights Act and the Great Society, you know, the Equal Employment Commission, the EEOC, that's meant to sort of enforce anti-discrimination policy, but it's just become so weakened over the years that you've sort of ended up where we have at-will employment, and, you know, Black workers and other marginalized workers are often, you know, last hired, first fired, sort of informally, and people say, oh, well, employers have the right to fire you no matter what. So I think fixing these institutions and countering these narratives are going to be key to sort of rebuilding these. But I'd love to hear what my panelists think.
I'll try to be quick. You know, to some extent, there's a greater problem of shortage of quality jobs than lack of people to fill those quality jobs. It very well may be cruel to do workforce development and there's no job waiting at the end. Similar, when we talk about financial literacy, all the financial literacy in the world is limiting if you have no finances. Could again potentially be cruel to have people go through those programs with no finances to manage in the first place. So I'll give you some other data points. When we look across race, not only do disparities persist with education and various outcomes, they often get larger. So the racial wealth gap gets larger at higher levels of education. Income gaps get larger at higher levels of education. If we look at health disparities, they get dramatically larger at higher levels of education. So I say all of this in that education is not the panacea to address our structural problems, and I think empirical evidence would suggest that. But that said, just like I began, we get to choose the things we want as an outcome for our economy. Why can't education in and of itself be one of the goals? There's great privilege that you all have in this room to be able to learn to synthesize information into big ideas, regardless of its vocational aspect. So again, if we're thinking about narratives, not only can we use empirical evidence to combat some of the myths, and race becomes a good mechanism to show that. You'll often find Black people with a college degree with worse outcomes than high school dropouts that are white. But on flip it, why don't we treat education as the outcome that we desire in a non-vocational way?
Yeah, I would say full disclosure, Mary is a neighbor of mine in Newark South Ward. And so I take the liberty to say that, Mary, your own experience here at Princeton, I'm sure, is a data point, right? I'm sure that you got to Princeton with a set of expectations around what a Princeton student would look like. And I'd imagine you got to class and you looked at some of your colleagues who were not Black and you thought, how'd you get here, right? And I would say that my own learning, you know, I grew up in a majority Black neighborhood. I had genius friends who didn't go to college. I had some who went away for selling drugs. I got to college and I was surprised to see many of my white colleagues doing the very things some of my friends who didn't go to college went away from. And some of those friends went on to become federal judges and more weren't disqualified for behaviors that sent some of my friends away to prison in high school. So I think just the narrative of your lived experience. I think I'll just keep it real as we close out. The idea of meritocracy, right, it wasn't dispelled just when reelected Trump began to create his cabinet again. I've been in places where I've seen like the CEO of a major corporation, in one case, a white guy, and he was a below average human being, like by a lot, Brandon. And I began to realize, this idea that you get to where you are on the strength of your skills and expertise is largely a fallacy. And people get to where they are, if we get honest, even here at Princeton, because of extraordinary opportunities that got you here.
I ain't gonna go as far as Brian.
I'm there. Because I think that clarity is important. Because if you live in the absence of that clarity, you believe you got to where you are because of something you did. And we exist in an environment that is very clearly about it affording some people advantages. And they begin to believe those advantages are advantages that they earned. And they build whole existences around that belief that they earned what they got. Sure, they worked hard, but there was an advantage that propelled folks to places, and it withheld folks access to those very places. And that really is a story of the reality in which we live, and it's important for us to be clear about that reality.
I believe Ta-Nehisi Coates calls it the dream.
The dream, right? The dream's true.
We have time for one more question. Oh, we'll do two more, the two of you. So one here, one there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, first off, thank you guys so much for coming. This has been great. My question is for anyone on the panel. I think we can all acknowledge that these big ideas are associated with big costs. So how do we think about, balancing thinking bigger with the financial realities? And subsequently, how do we frame policies rooted in love, things like baby bonds and universal income that would cost billions on a national level in a way that is politically feasible and palatable?
So at the federal level, we've seen the federal government be able to raise large sums of money and pay for things that they want with relative ease. So it's not infinite, but I think there's a growing consensus, I might get in trouble for this, amongst economists that spending towards productive things is certainly not as inflationary than towards unproductive things, but we have great capacities to do things. And then I'll also just say, budgets are moral documents. Mm-hmm. So look at a budget and then think about your values and see if they're consistent with the things that you think are what society should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just say, thinking of sort of the extreme case of a budget as a moral document, I read today that in order to pay for the Trump's tax cuts, the 2017 ones, which are now going to be extended, they have to find that money somewhere because tax cuts also cost money, and that money is going to come from Medicaid and SNAP and WIC and all of these other programs. So people find the money somewhere. And so there are policies that for, a budget which is moral in, an actual moral, the right moral way, there are definitely ways to find money. I think there are so many potential revenue raisers that Democrats have just been unwilling to pursue, raising the corporate tax rate, the estate tax, the inheritance tax. Like, we're sitting in Princeton, New Jersey. There's northern New Jersey. There's so much tax base. Like, we can find a way to pay for it, 100%. There just has to be the political will for it, I think.
I'll just quickly say, from a budget being a moral document, I remember we were fighting for Cover All Kids, which was to get New Jersey to provide health care that every kid, no matter who they were, had health care coverage in the state. And I think we needed like another $10 million to close the gap. And the front office at the time was like, I don't know where we're going to get this money from. And we were looking through the budget, and it just so happened that there was a line item in the budget of $10 million for subsidizing horse race prize packages. And so we said, hey, kids' health, Horse race prize packages. I don't know. Also, we were in the middle of the pandemic, so there was no horse races to be had. Maybe we could shift this money over here. And they were just like, oh, I don't know, that's gonna be hard. It's gonna be hard to do. It's a moral decision. What do you value, right? It said, don't tell me your morals, show me your budget. So these things are big ticket items. You know, Laura Derenoncourt, who's at this institution, said that, you know, to close the racial wealth gap at the federal level will cost $10 trillion. That is 3 times the size of the Inflation Reduction Act. But you don't got to eat the whole elephant at once. Yeah.
Not bigger than the Great Recession bailouts.
Thank you. Boom, mic drop right there. All right. And then you had a question, right? Yes.
Thank you all for a very stimulating, provocative panel. I want to pick up on Darrick's provocation that if we examine economic policy issues, stratification, without an identitarian lens, we're part of the problem. And in your first 2 policies you mentioned tonight were a UBI and a like reviving the Humphrey Hawkins bill from the 1970s for a federal jobs guarantee. I know you've written, I've written on, and Ryan mentioned tonight, a policy like reparations to address the wealth gap. And my question is, how do you see pursuing a policy or a broader kind of moral agenda like as proposed by William Julius Wilson of targeting through universalism? Like, does your provocation mean that we need an explicit racial reparations program, or could we have a very progressive wealth redistribution program by taxing wealth and then having massive baby bonds that are wealth scaled, and that's de facto racially progressive, but it's ostensibly race neutral in terms of how the policy is written? Do you see that as part of the problem still, to try to pursue equity through non-racially explicit policies that are inherently redistributive and racially equalizing? Or is that, you know, if I propose that, do I become part of the problem and not the solution, as you're saying?
Yeah. So one, I grew up with Dalton Conley, and his book, Being Black, Living in the Red, was transformative for me. He's a little older than me, so I was in graduate school when that came out. And then his other book, The Pecking Order, is one of the best books. It is the best book I've ever read on diffusing the meritocracy. And the genius of it is that, and I hope I don't misrepresent it, the genius of it is that a lot of our conversation about inequity in society is grounded in family upbringing, that you didn't come from the right family. He looks within family to refute the notions of meritocracy by finding different attributes in a qualitative way that one sibling might have had versus the other that led to huge differences in their trajectory. So I'm feeling cathartic to be in this moment just because of legacy. So to answer the question, one, my provocation was about the scholarship more so than the policy, but nonetheless, they're not unrelated. Baby bonds could close the racial wealth gap over time. Reparations would be more parsimonious and direct, and baby bonds and reparations are complements, not substitutes. The aspect of reparations that baby bonds doesn't have is truth and reconciliation, which, in addition to the compensatory aspects of reparations, truth and reconciliation allows us to address the concerns that Mary, did I say your name right? Mm-hmm. Mary, that Mary raised, which is poverty and inequality not being grounded in individual deficits, but resource deprivation. And that not only benefits black people, it benefits all of us. So I think they're both necessary. The one slight amendment, I hate UBI, but love guaranteed income. Mm-hmm. The universal aspect of UBI is inflation enhancing, but I know we're running out of time, so I won't get into those details, and I know that's not your main point anyway. Targeted universalism was a political strategy that doesn't work. Targeted universalism was grounded in the idea that black people are over-concentrated in certain domains, and if we target that poverty domain, it will necessarily lift black people up. But it was a political strategy. We won't say the word race out loud, or here's the other aspect of it, the extent of race in America is grounded in a concentration of poverty. Well, the statistics I cited to you earlier, that black people compared to white people have gross inequities across the spectrum of class, and that it actually grows, makes the point that race is not grounded to the extent that it's concentrated in poverty. But from a political standpoint, you're not fooling anybody with the notion of trying to not say race. And this is part of the point I'm trying to make. So this idea that we can address race without talking about race, all it does is constrain one side of the aisle or the dimension, while the other side uses it in a weaponized way, and you're constrained in your ability to address it. So the evolution from William Julius Wilson to, I'm not going to call anybody else out, but I think it's a bad political strategy, and analytically, I also think it's wrong.
I would just add that I don't think there is race-neutral policy. And if you think about the way policy is implemented, if you think about how it's administered, if you think about where it's administered, maybe everyone is eligible for it, but the way a black person interacts with our welfare system is vastly different than other people. It completely varies by state. And so I don't think policy is ever truly race-neutral, no matter if it was intended to be written that way. And yeah, I think not talking about it in the research phase or like the implementation phase is just gonna lead to these well-intended policies having really disparate outcomes like we've seen in the past.
I mean, I guess I appreciate the question. The one comes to mind is why not? Like, why do we keep running from race? You know, like, what is it about us that we keep wanting to repackage it as race neutral? And I think if there's a lesson, there's lots of lessons to be learned for sure, but I think if there's a lesson to be learned around Donald Trump's leadership, it is, trying to put it as charitably as I can, like, name the thing that you're doing, right? It's interesting because, like, again, 501c3 nonpartisan organization, Rasan, but you know, you have Donald Trump and his folks going for it, right? On that side, they're going for it. On the other side, you have a party that plays by a set of rules that it only plays by. Like, I think this is
like pay for too. I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, we're in a brand, like we're in a brand new moment to reimagine the landscape, right? And very often the question comes is, how will you pay for that thing? Yep. No one else asks that question. They do the thing they want to do, right? They prioritize what they want to prioritize, Asha's point, and they then find a way. And very often we start with a limiting principle. It's a practical question, to be sure. How do you pay for it? In our daily lives, we're constrained by the resources we have. But in the real world, people do the things they want to do, the political field, they do what they want to do, and they find ways to pay for it, or someone else will pay for it. And so I would invite us into a space, again, where our imagination is as vast as the opportunity, so that we can say things like the word we avoid. Like, it might be black, it might be reparations. Because either way, there is an adversary who is full steam ahead, and there's an opportunity to meet the moment by being as courageous on the right side of history.
Thank you very much. I'll say one more thing. It's just that we are about to enter a very topsy-turvy year in New Jersey politics. We haven't had this sort of wide open field for a governor in a long time, and you already see candidates making hollow, amorphous statements that mean nothing. As much as we can have spaces to get them on the record in a detailed fashion and not talk about state policy in a general way, but talk about state policy about New Jersey, the more that we can do that, the better. So whether it's this institution or other institutions you're a part of, I encourage you to try to have as many candidate forums as possible, because we need to get this right. All right, thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.